Good morning, everyone. It's Asha Nayaswami, and here we are again. We're still where we are. And I'm actually getting to be like all the jokes on the internet about people who don't know what day it is. I have a really hard time sometimes keeping it all straight. What's amazing to me is how time passes no matter what. No matter what you're doing, the inexorability of the progress of an incarnation goes on and on. I saw a joke on the internet. It's not a joke. It was something humorous that somebody else put up. It was actually put up by newscasters who just found it so hilarious. Maybe some of you have seen it. You have this really innocent lady there. She looks like she's in her 20s, and she's a music teacher. She's a school music teacher, and now she's furloughed, or she's not furloughed, but she's having to teach her music online. And she's so sweet. She has these big glasses and this hair like this. And she talks about that one of the ways she's been dealing with sheltering in place is that she decided to, she just write music. So she wrote a song about sheltering in place to express what it means to her and what it feels like. And then she picks up this little ukulele. She starts playing this little ukulele, and you see her little fingers. She's moving like that. And she opens her mouth to sing. And the lyrics to the song are this wild animal yowl. And she does it for a moment. Then she goes back to playing her little ukulele. And then it's time, and she screams again, and then she just plays. I mean, the newscasters were just dying with laughter. And I must confess, I was too. It was so perfectly done. And she just did it so, and every time when she'd stop screaming, she'd go back to her little ukulele and this little thing. So part of what is just saving everyone, you just have to move it into humor sometimes, because Swami talked about humor. Humor is not my subject today. My subject is anger, but humor and anger go together sometimes, because sometimes you can diffuse things with humor. It's one of the ways in which you can deal with frustration, is if you can just make it funny. In fact, Swami says one of the characteristics of a fanatic, which actually often leads to extraordinary negative excesses, is the inability to laugh. Because when you can't laugh, see, here's what, maybe I'm not going to talk about anger. Maybe I'm going to talk about humor. Let's see what happens today. We'll just change the title if we change it. Um, the When I asked Swami about humor, because I just, wit for me just comes so fast, really too fast in the sense that I don't always think clearly before I speak, because he asked me. We were standing on the balcony. Some of you have heard me say this, but we were standing on the balcony of the condominium in Hawaii in the summer of 1976. And the ocean was within sight, but we were looking down at the swimming pool, and the ocean had all these waves moving, like oceans do. Surprise, surprise. Guess what? The ocean was like an ocean. And the swimming pool, for some reason, too, just had this sort of white foam that was kind of moving. And so Swami sort of just, for no reason, said, "What's that?" Meaning, what's the white on the swimming pool? I said, "White caps," like that. you know, it was just a silly remark. And Swami liked to laugh, and we enjoyed each other because we both liked to say witty things. So we both laughed, but it was like there was no space between him asking me the question and my giving him the answer. It was just like he'd asked a perfectly reasonable question, and I gave him a perfectly absurd answer. And I said, what is that? What is it? What is humor? Like, where does it come from? Why is it there? And then Swami's answer was serious. And he said, to a very large extent, he said, humor is a spiritual quality. He doesn't, being witty is a particular way that your mind is wired. So it's not like you have to be witty to be spiritual, but having a sense of humor is a spiritual quality, because it's really simple. You look at something one way, and you can just turn it and see it another way. So your mind isn't locked into any sort of track of reality, but you're always fluid. And especially when you're humorous, you can always just stand back and see, we don't have to take this so seriously. We can also find just kind of an easy way to do this. And I've seen many times how many difficult situations are often diffused with humor, where people feel tense, and then all of a sudden they find a way to, just to let it down. I can't remember the exact story, but there was this man from South Africa. Actually, it was Trevor Noah, who's a well-known television personality who grew up in South Africa. I can't remember the whole story, and I'm sure I couldn't do it justice anyway. But he talked about one of his. He's of mixed race, but during the apartheid years, and his grandfather, who was a black man, which was an insecure position at that time in South Africa, just being in some extremely tense standoff with white people who had great power to hurt him, and just with the right witticism, he just turned the whole thing, and everyone just it had to do with, kissing, white men or black men kissing, uh, black men kissing white women, or white men kissing black women, and he diffused it by saying the last remark was, "Well, you've never seen my grandmother," and it's sort of like all of a sudden, just it was man to man about attractive women. It didn't have anything to do with race. It was just the right thing to say at just the right time. So there has to be a certain lightness of spirit, even for your mind to go there, to be able to say that. Once, in another occasion, I was driving in a car with Swami, and I don't know what it was, but I said something. It was humor. It was good humor. He laughed. It was appropriate humor, but it was cheeky. It was just kind of a cheeky uh, way of dealing with Swamiji. And for just a moment, I had this great fear for my immortal soul. Like, this is my spiritual teacher. I owe everything to him. And here I am just making jokes like he was my kid brother or something. And I just like froze, like, is this really appropriate? I mean, this was years into our relationship, so it was a little late to ask the question. If I was condemned to hell, I was long since condemned. But I thought maybe I could salvage a year or two. I'll take a little off my sentence by asking him the question. So I asked him, I said, did you ever tease Master? Because Swami has talked about what a good sense of humor Master had. And in fact, in the biography of Yogananda, there's this, which is also a really great book. In the biography of Yogananda, there's a chapter in which I think it's called Salient Characteristics of My Guru. I'm not going to be able to find it just by flipping the pages. Salient characteristics of my Guru, and one of them quite high on the list was a sense of humor. Now, it's not that Master was witty, it's that Master was always ready to laugh. And Swami was always ready to laugh, because laughter is it brings out what's deep in you. And if you're always ready to laugh, that means that no matter what's happening, you're right on the edge of bliss. You're right on the edge of joy. Joy is one of the 8 manifestations of God. So I said, sir, did you ever tease Master? I mean, Swami teased me all the time. In one of my books, I mentioned where he teased me about something, God knows what it was, because there was always a lot to tease me about. And I decided to be petulant. Oh, sir, you're making fun of me, I said like that. And then Swami got very serious. No, he said, I'm not actually making fun of you. I'm merely taking advantage of the fun which is already present. And that was typical Kriyananda humor. He would just take it when Uma, who was born in Manchester, England, left Manchester at the age of 18 to come and be what else but an English nanny in New York City, I think. And then has been she was in America for most of her life. After that, maybe 6 or 7, maybe as long as 10 years ago, she moved to a community in Assisi, and that's been her home ever since. But she asked Swami, because she had no connection with Manchester. Nothing about that atmosphere felt like home to her, and as soon as she was able, she left it. So she said, Swamiji, why was I born in Manchester, England? And Swami said, oh, to get an English accent so that we could all tease you about it for the rest of your life. And that was like, oh yes, that's perfectly obvious reason, because her accent provided us untold amusement. So there you are. But you see, it's just like seeing what's happening, thinking it's all so serious, even like, why was I born in England? Or, concerned about my immortal soul. I haven't finished with Swamiji. And you just turn it. You just can just on a dime, you can just see it from another angle. And that creates a certain flexibility in the mind that when things are more difficult, you can just keep turning it. You don't feel that one option is the only option. I'm going to come back to this in just a second. Creativity and prosperity. I was going to say to whom? Remind me. Okay, remind me. Um, the Oh, but with Swamiji, when I asked him if he ever teased Master, he said, "Oh no." He said, "No, no. I was a young disciple." He said, "I was much too in awe of him. I could never have teased him. I just couldn't have done it." He said Dr. Lewis teased him though a lot because Dr. Lewis was the same age as Master. Dr. Lewis was a dentist in Massachusetts, outside of Boston, and Master had just come to America. It was like, just in 1920, 21, 22, right in there. Master had just come to America. Dr. Lewis was one of the first. I believe he was his first disciple in America. And they were both like 26 years old. And there was no entourage around Master. There was no mystique. I mean, of course there was a mystique because he was a God-realized Master and he was exotic in the extreme. In 1920, we were not living in the global village that we're living in now, especially not, in that part of America, which was very conservative. Mrs. Lewis talks about seeing Master all dressed in orange with his long hair and his dark skin. I mean, her first thought wasn't, "Oh, there's my guru." Her first thought was, "Who is that strange man?" Now, Dr. Lewis had an immediate divine experience with Master. Master touched him and put Dr. Lewis into a deep state of cosmic consciousness, seeing the spiritual eye and so on. It took a little longer for Master to win Mrs. Lewis, Doctor's wife, but he did before too long, and they both became disciples. But they were still, there was no, Master hadn't written Autobiography of a Yogi. We knew very little about India. Just the whole story of Master was not anywhere. He was just this wonderful person who had come into their family, often visited in their home. They traveled together. He knew their children. Kamala Silva writes the same way. Master Kamala Silva in her books talks about how Master would come and stay at the home of her and her mother, and how Master would read to them at night. One night they put on a Shakespeare production, and Master read to them, and they lit candles. I mean, it was just very creative friendship, and the Master. Well, I'm really seeing all sorts of things here. This it's something that gets lost over time because the myth begins to take over the man. And this is why Swami Kriyananda repeatedly at the end of his life, well, because the reverence, the appropriate reverence for who Swamiji was and what he could bring to him increased and increased, especially in the last decade or so of his life. It was like in the last decade of his life. Prior to that time, Swami himself had kept a sort of veil over most people's perception of him. But in the last decade or so, especially after he went to India in 2003, he just let the veil drop. And especially in India, where their sensitivity to vibrations is so much stronger and where they trust their spiritual perception. It began in Italy because the tradition of saints in the Italian culture also, and the heart nature of the Italian people, and they trust their feelings in spiritual matters. Americans have a tremendous amount of heart and a lot of intuition, but we're also, it's very deep in the American character to be shrewd. And it's very embarrassing for Americans to think we've been naive and been taken advantage of. As Swami said, the Italians crossed that barrier a long time ago. They just don't worry about it. But for Americans, it's very important to be shrewd. It's just part of our character. Every country has its positive and negative, and every negative has a positive side, and every positive has a negative side. So, I mean, we're very, very practical. And that makes us Americans, I'm speaking for us as Americans, that makes us very effective in the world. but it also can handicap us spiritually, because we'll have, as a people, individual Americans, and I've certainly experienced it. I don't know the world like Swami knew the world, but I've certainly experienced it in America, that people will have a very deep experience. They'll be overwhelmed with happiness and relief and inspiration, and they'll tell you that their lives are changed, and from now on, this is my path, and then you never see them again because they go home and they start thinking about it. And then they become suspicious. They become suspicious of their own feelings. And then they get scared. What if? What if it's not really what I think it is? Don't trust the heart in the same way that other people's do, and don't trust intuition in the same way that other people do. So when Swamiji, when Swamiji came to America, well, I say came to America because he grew up in Europe. He was 13 when he came to America. But growing up in Europe, especially growing up in Romania, which Swami said was sort of a crossroads between East and West. So he's born of American parents. He lives in an Anglo-American, an English-American enclave, because his father worked for Standard Oil as an oil geologist. And so they had brought in people from England and America to Romania to develop the oil resources of Romania. So the immediate little, enclave is the word, that Swami lived in, the small enclave of the families that worked for Standard Oil, was English and American. But the whole thing was set in the middle of Romania. And then Swami's parents were American. And then, of course, you have his whole reincarnational relationship with the whole world. He spoke 4 languages by the time he was 10. He spoke Romanian, English, German, and then for health reasons, they sent him to Switzerland for a couple of years, and he learned to speak French. He said at one point his German was better than his English because his nanny was a German, so he talked German to her all the time. People who heard Swami speak German at the end of his life, they said what he spoke was, they called it Kinder German, which was not only that it was a little bit simple because Swami never learned it well as an adult. They said he spoke it somewhat in the accent of a child. Now, when I said that to Swamiji, I said, they tell me that you speak Kinder German. I don't speak any language but English, so I have no way to judge. And I said, because they said your accent is like that of a child. And Swami said, it's deliberate. He said, I prefer German spoken like that. It was just interesting because sometimes some people could say that language lacks sweetness. And so Swamiji by speaking it as a child, he was able to make it somewhat sweeter. These are just things he said to me. But it's just when people would ask about his accent, in his American accent, because having spoken multiple languages as a child, what is your native language? And then when he went to England, just before he came back to America, he spent a couple of years in England going to school and developed an English accent. So by the time he arrived in America, he had an English accent, which as a young high schooler, the boys bullied him over it rather than admired it. So he had to deliberately then get rid of his English accent, which he had to develop in England because they didn't like his American accent, blah, blah. So by the end of all of this, Swami says, I don't have an accent when I speak English. I speak English the way I think it ought to be spoken. That's how he put it. Just making it sound vibrationally to match what I'm trying to communicate. This is something Swamiji taught all of us who are public speakers, and also when we would, and not merely would, but do read the Festival of Light, which is the ritual that we do every Sunday. He said every word has a vibration, and that vibration is really what communicates the meaning. And because words are just symbolic, people will associate the symbol, with whatever that symbol means to them. He said for some people, when you say the word home, it conjures up security and warmth and love. Those who might have grown up in difficult circumstances, you say the word home, and what it conjures up for them is anxiety and even abuse. So the same word. But when you imbue it with the vibration of the meaning that you're trying to convey, people will receive the vibration actually more than they receive the word. And in that way, communication happens much better, which is why often when Swami would speak, you would feel it so deeply in yourself. And I would often understand something that I didn't understand until he said it, even though the words might not have been new to me. But he would imbue the words with a vibration, and then I would receive it. I had one really interesting experience with him. Not one, but one time this experience became very vivid. He would often come through the community where I live, Palo Alto, because the biggest international airport in relation to Ananda Village, where Swami would usually live in America, is right here. It's 30 minutes from this community. So whenever he would fly in and out of the country, which was often, he would usually arrange to spend some time in this community. And he would often give a satsang in our church. So I have many, many experiences of Swami in the church and my sitting there listening to him. And I developed the habit, which I actually still do sometimes when I listen to him in video, although of course it was easier to concentrate when he was in person. I would try as much as possible to be absolutely in the moment. And I would often I could anticipate the flow of Swami's thoughts because I had heard him speak hundreds, thousands of times. And so I could often, not always, but I could often anticipate where he was going. And so I would just concentrate in the moment, try not to anticipate, and try to just accept what he was saying word by word. And as I did that, and once it was especially vivid, but it was always true, I realized that Swami was projecting vibration first. And even within himself, he was projecting vibration. He was feeling vibration. Then he was finding words to put onto that vibration. He described his own process of speaking that he often, he said, really did not know what the next word was going to be. And sometimes he said he would say things like, now here's an important point, without having any idea what the important point was going to be. But he said he could just feel an important point was coming. I mean, that is surrender on a scale we can only aspire to. But I remember just realizing how insignificant the words were, but it was the vibration that he was putting forth. And absorbing the vibration became the way of communicating with him. It became really vivid once when I was in Italy, listening to him speak at a public event in Rome. I don't know whether translation was an option or not, but whatever it was, I didn't take it. And I can't speak Italian. I've heard it enough that I can recognize words. And again, sometimes I could deduce some of where he was going because I could pick up enough words and I would be familiar enough. But I remember listening to half an hour, 45 minutes of a talk, feeling that that Swami was communicating profoundly to me. And then I realized he was speaking a language I didn't know. And I really actually didn't know what he'd said, but I knew what he said. Not conceptually, but vibrationally. Isn't that interesting? Fascinating. Now, speaking of spontaneity, we're going to have to completely forget any topic. We're going to call this one a little of this and a little of that. And tomorrow I'll talk about the other subject, which is I had some questions about anger, and I will present them, but I wasn't in the mood today to talk about anger. So I'm going to come all the way back to Swami talking about that Dr. Lewis was able to tease Master. Their relationship was just completely different. Master, that wasn't in any way that Dr. Lewis did not know who Master was. It wasn't that he didn't have appropriate reverence for him. It was just the way they were able to be together. And the interesting part of all of that is that when I asked Swami that question, he said, when I was with Master, I was too young. Oh, I know where I was also going. I was talking about the fact that Swamiji himself and Master, Swami talked about the fact, and he realized that this was part of just part of many things. But he said when Master came to America, he deliberately presented himself not as an exceptional being. And Autobiography of a Yogi is written with so much humility. As Swami said, you get the impression that anybody could just go over to India and stand on a street corner, sort of stretch your arms out, and some God-realized master is going to tap you on the chest and put you in samadhi. Master doesn't make it clear, who he was and what his sadhana was and what his karma was that he had all these experiences, because Master came to America to tell us that we could realize God, that all we have to do is just, take Kriya, do a little meditation, and bingo, we've got it. And Master loved the American spirit, and he loved the fact, and Master put it this way, Master said, in India, they understand what God realization means. And they have a very, well, maybe someday attitude about it. After all, I have my karma, I have my worldly duties, someday, maybe. He said, in America, where we knew nothing about what God realization meant, and we have this can-do practical spirit, Americans just said, God realization, sure, we can do it. I just love that. Sure, we can do it. And because of that, we can, we do. Sure, we can do it. That's the positive side of this American temperament. So Master Swami said, presented himself deliberately as not being that different than the people he was talking to. Because if he was different, then what would his message mean? His message was sure, you can do it. After all, you're a master. And in fact, an Indian disciple who had that attitude, when Master was urging upon him some heroic self-effort, the man said, well, certainly you can do it, sir. You're a master. And Yogananda replied, and what do you think made me a master? He said, it was by doing, not by saying I can't. And so, but Master had to make us feel that we were in a unity with him. And he held that really mostly until close to the end of his life. And then Swamiji was extremely that way. And he said it explicitly. I feel I can accomplish more as a simple, unaffected friend to people than in any other role. Now, in that same context, he said, Master told me that I would not, speaking of Swami, I'm not speaking of myself. Master told Swami that he would not only be a teacher, but that he would have spiritual responsibility for people. Now, Swami never bothered to extrapolate from that point, but much later he did, but not in that context. For most people, he said, I'm a necessary link between them and Master. And that by attuning themselves to his consciousness, we can then attune ourselves to Master's consciousness. Not for everyone, certainly not for everyone in the world, and not even for everyone who's part of Ananda. Within Master's families, there's many smaller families, because that's the way it's always worked. From Master to disciple, from that disciple to everyone. The prince, as I said it recently, I think in one of these, Master was the king of the country, and Swamiji was the prince assigned to take care of a certain province. And that was the province that many of us, are citizens of. And that's where we find it. Now, by the end of Swami's life, there was so much reverence around him that there would be this big thing and these big introductions and these big halls and this big effort. And Swami himself would often laugh. He would say he would feel like there would be this timpani and trumpets and the orchestra and this big thing. And then he said a little mouse then would just walk out on stage. And he said once about himself, he said, the older I get, the more the myth of Kriyananda swirls around me. The more I feel the myth of Kriyananda swirling around me. And then he sort of shrugged his shoulders. He said, but in the middle of it, I'm just the same old guy. He said his self-image actually was always as a child of Master. That's all he ever thought of himself as. Now, there's one more trailing thought I want to finish before this, which will take us a couple of minutes longer, just this. Swamiji said by the time in 1958, when he went to India, and by that point he'd been a disciple for 10 years, and he met Anandamoyi Ma, with whom he had a very, very deep connection. She's the joy-permeated mother described in Autobiography of a Yogi. They had a very close relationship. Ma actually said about him, of all those who have come before me, he said, there have been none who have drawn me as much as you have, or have drawn as much from me. Now, I may have misquoted that slightly, but it's close to that. However she exactly put it, she reciprocated. And Swami said with her, he had the kind of relationship he was not old enough to have with Master. He said, it was completely at ease, and it was humorous, and it was lighthearted, and it was spontaneous and completely natural. He said with Master, he was always a little bit too much in awe. He said he wasn't afraid of Master, but he was a little too young and a little too much in awe, because Master was gone before Swami was 26, just 3.5 years. But he said with Ma, it was almost the way Swami had it. It was like Master brought me to Ma. That's not what Swami said, but that's how he's felt it, so that I could have that kind of relationship. That, it's like she substituted and allowed me to be completely myself and at ease in a way that I couldn't mature fast enough to be with Master. Isn't that lovely? So they laughed and joked a lot. Anandamoyi Ma also had a great sense of humor and really liked to laugh. And so she and Swami were able to be that way. So no, Swami said, it's all right. You can treat me like that. You can take advantage of the fun which is already present, as long as one doesn't cross the line of disrespect or unkindness. But keeping the mind flexible, being ready to laugh. Master's entire poem, Samadhi, of cosmic consciousness, ends, a tiny bubble of laughter. I have become the sea of mirth itself. A tiny bubble of laughter. I am become the sea of mirth itself. Let us strive in this and always to emulate the Master and become as he was. God bless you.